Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 5:30 p.m. session of the 2016 OpenSimulator Community Conference. As a reminder to our in-world and web audience, you can view the full conference schedule at conference.opensimulator.org and tweet your questions or comments to @OpenSimCC with the hashtag OSCC16. I am Cynthia Caloyne, aka Lear Lobo, your moderator. Today I am happy to introduce the session called The Sad, Sorry State of Weapons Development. Our speaker today is Mike Higgins. Mike is an ocean engineer and runs stores called Ocean Engineering, where he produces objects that require good physics. After 4 decades of writing code in the virtual world, Kayaker Magic has been scripting in virtual worlds since 2008. He started by extending his love of water sports, especially kayaking, sailing, and surfing into Second Life, and then OpenSim. But he has expanded his interests into many different fields of scripting here, including weapons development. Over to you, Kayaker.
Hello. Well, I have to confess that I'm not a person who's very big on first shooter type games, and I got into weapons development as kind of an aside of building critters that people wanted to shoot, and so I started developing weapons and discovered some problems in OpenSimulator that made it not as easy as I thought it should be to make weapons. And I'm going to start with some of the things that I think are really showstoppers, and then I'll move on to things that work a lot better, so that we end on a happy note with things getting better and better for weapons in Second Life. And the first thing I'm going to do is demonstrate a bug that I think is the real showstopper, which is that it is very difficult to aim a weapon in OpenSim. If I point my weapon at this target, boy, I was really lucky there. I hit really close. But if I try and correct my aim, I say, well, I should aim a little bit lower and to the right, and I shoot again. Well, that time it worked. I'm having trouble reproducing the bug. If you look up on the slide, the first shot was a little low and to the left, and you move further and further to the right and a little bit higher and higher, and the bullet keeps going through the same hole. It's sort of like the scene in Support Your Local Sheriff where he says the bullet went through the hole in the washer. The bullet keeps hitting the same spot, and the routine get camera rot keeps returning the same value until you've rotated your gun like 10 degrees, and so you can't aim a weapon in OpenSim with an accuracy of less than 10 degrees, and that's really frustrating. And people who want to play games in OpenSim that require aiming weapons accurately get very frustrated, and they quit. So I'm going to mention, for those who don't know, that the way that you script a weapon in originally from Second Life, this is the legacy SL type weapon that you point. You first wear the weapon, you point it at something, you go into mouse look mode, you point it at something you want to destroy, and then you click your left mouse button. The script in The script inside the weapon, in the legacy weapons, it resed a bullet. When you clicked on the left mouse button, the bullet was resed with a high velocity. It flies with physics. When it collides with something, the physics engine or some other part of OpenSim detects the collision, and it sends event messages to the bullet, which may do an effect like producing smoke. and it sends an event collision message to the object that's hit, which may sink if it's a boat. It may produce a black spot like this target, and some people say that this is a bit of like an old-fashioned way of doing things, that in modern video games, using the physics engine to throw rocks around like a caveman is kind of old-fashioned, and they're saying we're going to be using newer ways that aren't so hard on the server and aren't so hard on the physics engine. So everything this should work well, but there seem to be a few problems. One of which is that it's so difficult to aim normally in OpenSim. It seems to be working very well here today. There's a lot of different physics engines. There's at least 3 of them available to us, and there's some hope that the physics engine from the Halcyon project will become available as an option in OpenSim one day. So we'll have 4 different physics engines that we might want to use, and so that introduces a lot of problems. And then there's a general problem with several of the physics engines, that if you're firing a small object like a bullet, an object that's really small, the simulation that's done in the physics engine is done at a certain time step. The object may pass through the target without noticing that it's passed through it, and so sometimes your objects tunnel through targets and you miss. And I submitted that as a Mantis 8009 just to get that in the system, but I'm assured that it's unlikely to ever be fixed without making big changes to the physics engine that aren't going to happen. And the solution that a lot of people do is they take their bullets and they make them longer and longer until they have a high probability of hitting a target. And so instead of being a caveman throwing rocks, I'm a caveman throwing spears. And another interesting problem is that resing physical bullets isn't allowed in many places. People don't want to open their worlds, their regions up to griefing, so they don't allow resing, and you can't use a weapon that reses bullets. So one solution to this would be to use, like people say, modern video games are all using something like a cast ray type weapon. And this bow that I have here is such a weapon with a couple improvements. And it sounds like such a wonderfully clean system. The weapon casts a ray. The cast ray detects any objects that might be in the path that you were pointing the weapon in, and then the weapon sends a message to the target saying you've been hit, and the target knows what to do with that. If it's a avatar, the avatar can wear a thing called a meter that role-playing people are familiar with, that gets that message and tells the avatar that they've been hit. You have to add a script to your pirate boat if you want it to detect being hit by cannonballs, for example. So, boy, this looks like a really wonderful system. Let's switch to that. And oh my God, there's all kinds of problems with cast ray. And I've listed all the mantises that I know of, many of which I submitted, that have to do with cast ray. And the first problem is that the default cast ray is not complete. It is lacking a lot of features, and it doesn't detect the actual shape of the object you're shooting at. As a matter of fact, it detects anything that casts ray through it with by detecting the axis-aligned bounding box, which means if you take a long, skinny object and rotate it, its cast ray detects an even larger rectangular area around it. And so you're always shooting at things and missing because you hit some invisible object in the middle of the room that's just the bounding box of some other object nearby. There's a second cast ray that is available for your regions, which you can enable in the INI file, and it's called cast ray version 3. and it is much more complete. But it has some bugs also, some of these other Mantis numbers. And one of the bugs that it has is that when you ask it to not detect phantom objects, it does anyway. And so if you're hunting dinosaurs in the forest, and there's a tree, and they're hiding in the trees, well, you ought to be able to shoot in between the trees, but the leaves, which are phantom objects, stop the bullets. And then there are other bugs that have to do with when you're using debugging your weapon in your home region, and it's a 1x1 var region, namely it's a regular sized region. Cast ray seems to work really well, but when you go to a var region, you discover that cast ray gets really slow. Even when you tell cast ray to only look a short distance, it takes a long time for cast ray to be processed by the server. And I was getting times as long as 1.2 seconds. So you would point your gun at something, you'd pull the trigger, and nothing would happen. And you'd lower your weapon, you'd scratch your head, and you'd look around, and then all of a sudden, bang, the bullet would hit what you pointed it at. And that's not a very convenient way for things to work. Now, fortunately, I've been talking to, I've been submitting Mantises and at least talking to Ubit at the developers meetings, and he is actively working on this, and I have hopes that and it's getting faster and faster, and I have hopes that it will drop below the 500 millisecond. I told him I would stop complaining about how slow cast ray was when it got below a half a second. So I'll stop complaining now. No more complaints. I'll talk about how wonderful things are. And one of the complaints that people have about cast ray weapons is that when you throw a physical bullet, you get to see the physical bullet move, and when it hits something, it can do things like it can go pwang, it can make noises, it can make a puff of smoke, it can do interesting things, but a cast ray weapon can't. And yet I have a cast ray weapon right here, and it is leaving arrows on things that I shoot at and producing puffs of smoke, and I can even stick an arrow in some of these prims. And I can't see them because I'm looking at them on edge, but you see the arrows appear there. And this is a way I found of making cast ray weapons much more believable by having a pool of invisible prims that I call bullet effects. And they're normally invisible. And when you fire a weapon and it's broadcasting this message to tell the target you've been hit, it broadcasts that message on an open channel. And the pool of invisible bullet effects prims listen, and one of them jumps up, moves to the spot that you were pointing at, becomes visible, makes a puff of smoke or a splash of blood or whatever, and then you have the illusion that you had a bullet fly from your weapon to the target, and it's a much more satisfying experience. I'm having a lag issue here. And another technique that I've seen people use in role-playing situations is a hybrid effect. I'm going to mention a couple of different hybrid type weapons that I've tried writing code for, and that I've tried and I've seen other people use. For me, because I'm not I think I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not a person who even enjoys first-person shooter games. I found the intellectual challenge of finding a way of building a weapon that doesn't require rezzing, so you can run it in even in a region where rezzing is not allowed, was an intellectual challenge that I found really interesting, and so that's why I had that previous slide of the bullet effects type weapon, which can be rezzed beforehand by the landowner, and then people can come and fire weapons and see the arrows appear without having to use a weapon that requires rezzing and doesn't require that you give everybody permission to grief you. So here's another technique I've seen people use. This requires resing, but what they do is they have the bullet send the message instead of having the weapon send the message. They have the bullet send a message when it hits something, and that way the bullet can communicate a bunch of things like how powerful a bullet I am, whether I'm a flame arrow and you should catch on fire, and it can supply much more information than just the you've been hit. It can supply other information that might be necessary for your role play. And here's another technique for living in a world where you're not allowed to res things, and that's a cannon that has the cannonball is a Prim that is linked into the cannon and which is linked into, say, a pirate boat. And when you fire the cannon, instead of a physical bullet flying, instead of sending a message, the cannon actually offsets that Prim so that it moves. This can be rather jerky. It moves in spits and starts, but it does come out of the cannonball and it does fly around, and then using some technique like cast raying ahead of itself, it determines whether or not it's about to hit something. Well, if it takes 1.5 seconds for the cast ray to run, this is totally unusable. If cast ray gets really fast, then we can use cast ray. And the cannonball could also use sensor, for example, to find objects that it thinks it might run into. But then it has to do a bunch of extra calculations in order to determine, well, am I just detecting a nearby object that I'll miss, or am I going to hit it? And so sensor might be very expensive to have the script do all this calculation, where it would be much more efficient to have the simulator do that calculation for it. And then after this cannonball hits something and makes a puff of smoke or whatever, it returns to the cannon and gets ready for the next shot that it's going to fire. So a couple other silly ideas. Well, I don't know how good I am for time, so I'll just move on.
Mike? Hey,
yes?
Kayaker, you have 1 minute left.
Well, that's perfect. So I'll skip the other silly ideas, and I will just say that I have a booth in Expo Area 4. It's called Ocean Engineering because of my original water ideas that I was going to bring here. And but in that booth, I have a box of free scripts. It has sample weapons that show how to use cast ray to implement a weapon. As a matter of fact, you could just take some of these scripts and drop them in a mesh gun, for example, and pick it up and start firing with it. The box includes some of these effects prims, so there's an effects bullet that will produce a puff of smoke on the other end of the direction you were pointing your gun, and it has some sample targets. It has a blimp you can shoot down, and it has targets that say, "Oh, I've been hit by whoever was firing at them," and so those are fun to play with. And I have all of these things set up in the sandbox so that you can go to the sandbox right after this talk, and I will go there if anyone wants to ask more questions that we don't answer here. I'll hang out in the sandbox for a short while, but I want to go to the party too.
That's right. Absolutely. And thank you for such a wonderful session.
Okay, you're welcome.
As a reminder to our audience, you can see the conference schedule at conference.opensimulator.org. This session concludes Sunday's OSCC16's events, but there will be an after party on Pirates Atoll in DigiWorld's grid. Also, there are numerous events like Survival Sim, where everyone's a winner, or on the Air University Metaverse. That'll be on December 15th, so be sure to look at the schedule for all of the community events at conference.opensimulator.org. We encourage you to visit the OSCC16 Poster Expo in the OSCC Expo Zone 3 region to find accompanying info on presentations and explore the Hypergrid tour resources in OSCC Expo Zone 2, along with sponsor and crowdfunder booths located throughout all of the OSCC Expo regions. Thank you again to Kayaker and to our audience.